friends.
Hello. Oh, my God. What doing?
Yeah, what have you set up? That looks amazing. Where are you?
I've got one of those Luvo lights, but this is my bedroom. Yeah, it's great.
Have you always got a black curtain in your bedroom?
It's actually really dark green and the walls are pink. It's amazing.
Oh, wow. Rick Morton is a journalist and author, and he's also learnt to memorise phone numbers, specifically ones from debt collectors. Because up until recently, Rick was very bad with money. So bad that he used to borrow from everyone around him, and it was an incredibly destructive, distressing force in his life. So how did he break the cycle? From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people like Rick Morton, who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be all kinds of vulnerable. Rick was born the son of a cattle baron in Central Queensland. It's not usually the start of a story about someone who has struggled with poverty, but he grew up dirt poor after a family rift. He grew up in housing commission and he spent his life overspending every cent that he had. I've spoken to Rick once before on this podcast. It was a hugely popular episode about his upbringing. And Rick also used to work here at Mamma Mia. He's a remarkable journalist, an award-winning one, in fact, and his story is truly remarkable too. Rick's new book on money examines the meaning of money to him and lots of people. It talks about his struggles with poverty and how we often view money as a kind of substitute for morality. It's a really, really interesting conversation. Here's Rick. Rick, when you need to borrow money, when you know you need to borrow money, tell me about the process. Like, at what point do you know you need to borrow it, and then how does it roll out from there?
Oh, God, that question immediately just brought stress back to me. So there is, it's tried and true, this method, because it happened the same way every time, which was I realised I needed to borrow money about 5 days before I need the money, and I don't do anything about it because the fear of asking even my closest friends is just so great. It's so embarrassing and I feel so much shame about it. Bearing in mind that I used to do this at least once every fortnight. And then basically when it gets to the point where there is no other option left and like I will not make rent, or I've already missed rent, but now I've got a final warning. When I'm in that corner, that's when I strike. And I just it's literal desperation that drives me to ask the question. And then I feel total and overwhelming guilt until I've paid the money back, which is almost always in my history, 3 or 4 days later. I'm just waiting for pay cycles. But every time it happened, I went through that same process. And every time it was excruciating at a cellular level, unfortunately.
You dedicate your book to all the people who've lent you money, and it's quite a long list. There are some names in there that I recognise. How did you decide who, when you know you need to borrow money, how do you decide which person to ask?
That's actually a really good question because it was different for different people. So, and this sounds incredibly cold, I guess, in a way, but it's just the mathematics or the arithmetic of someone who's desperate. So if it was an everyday kind of expense and I needed $100, the pool of people was wider because I knew that they most likely had it. So I could ask, close friends like Candace or Kylie. Candace and Kylie were a couple and they had a really great set of finances because Kylie was the opposite of me, even though she'd grown up really poor. And so if I needed to make rent just for a week, I knew that they would have the money and they were also just really cool about loaning it to me because they knew I'd get it back to them the next day. If it was a large amount of money, then there were essentially 3 people that I knew well enough who had the money, including a friend I went to university with who is like just bonkers rich. So I don't know how else to put it. He's my age. But even then, it's funny because that smaller group of people was also the hardest one to ask because they see money completely differently. And so my friend, he's one of my dearest friends, but every time he would just make me send him an email going, "Hi, it's Rick. As requested, I'd like to borrow $2,000. It's for my bond payment on this apartment, and I've agreed to give it back to you within this time frame." And I'd email it to him. It's not that he didn't trust me, but he's just so used to dealing with money in that way that that's what we did. But God, it was awkward.
How would those conversations go? Like, would you sort of have to do some small talk? But like, how's it going? How are the kids? What's happening at work?
Yes. And yet the more small talk I did, the more guilty I felt that I was kind of just there using them for cash. And so, a lot of the list of names at the front of this book would have been way longer, except that these are all recurring loans. So like after a certain point, and a lot of them were my best friends anyway, after a certain point, I knew that I could just ask. I still went through the torment of waiting 5 days myself, but when it got down to it and I was stuck, I would just be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, but do you have $500? And if it was a no, that's totally fine. And then I'd go and work my way around the list of most likely options. It was like a game, I guess, in that sense, where I just had to figure out the best matches on any given day for the best amount of money and the person who was least going to be put out by it, I guess.
One of the things you write about is about how being poor robs you of time and energy, like how it bends time and space. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and this comes from my own experience and certainly since the book came out from other people's experience. But all of that stuff that I was just talking about, the mental energy, even before you go and ask the person for money, the mental energy that goes into, am I a bad person for doing this? How am I going to ask them? What's the form of language that I'm going to ask them? Because I care about how they feel and I care about how they feel about me. So I do think about this stuff at length, and that's just, borrowing money. But when you don't have any, before it gets to the point where you realize I've got to borrow cash, you're thinking, how can I actually make this work without having to ask anyone for help? Because it's the last thing I want to do. It's so degrading to my mind. And so this is where the time factor comes into it. Like you actually have to spend all of this energy on making these tiny kind of calculations. And, there's a stat in the book which, the human brain takes up about 2 to 3% of the body's total weight. But at rest, when it's doing nothing at all, except just keeping you humming along, it takes up 1/4 of your energy, like 1/4. And that's the cognitive tax we pay. And that's where time comes into it. But space as well. Like literally, if you've got cash, your horizons are bigger. I talk about my financial poverty a lot, but I also mean cultural. And often those two things are side by side or adjacent in that sense because, I never went to the city. I didn't know what other foods were like from other cultures just because we couldn't afford to try. And we certainly couldn't afford to buy a meal that we thought maybe we would hate. So we just never did. We just went Old Faithful every time. And that's just a small example of how space becomes either constricted or opened up when you've actually got enough to get by.
You talk about asking people for money, but there's someone that you start your book off by mentioning who asked you for money, and his name was Lee. Can you tell me about Lee?
Oh, Lee. I miss him sometimes. We had a really strange relationship. I mean, and we should have. It should have been strange. Lee was my debt collector from the age of almost 19. I got this credit card when I was 18. I just moved away from home. I had no money, certainly no sense. I had a new job in a new city that I'd been to 4 times before, and I'd got this credit card, maxed it out buying a stupidly expensive camera because I loved photography, and then couldn't afford the repayments because I earned $450 a week as a first-year cadet journalist. And I was paying for the first time for rent and phone bills and internet and all the rest of it. And so Lee was assigned from Credit Corps to basically get the money back over what turned out to be, I think it was 4 or 5 years. I mean, in that time that he was playing tag with me, he got married, he had his first child. And all the while I was stringing this out for as long as I could, not because I didn't want to give them the money. It was the first thing I wanted to do, but I just couldn't afford to live and make these payments. And so I would figure out what the bare minimum was. So if I made one payment every 5 or 6 weeks, and then he would chase me the next 5 or 6 weeks, and then I'd make another payment. So it's just enough to keep him on the hook. And so we had this kind of backwards and forwards relationship where he was either chastising me or being really nice and being like, hey, man, well done. You seem to be doing okay. But he seemed genuinely interested in my well-being, which was not something I expected from a debt collector.
Yeah, I was going to ask what those conversations were like. Would he be like, hey, Rick, it's Lee, and would your stomach drop?
Yes. I mean, I still do this. I recognize numbers even without having saved them in my phone. I do this now with, the occasional source who I don't want to talk to at any given point. But with Lee, I knew the number, but I never quite knew the context of the call. And I never knew which Lee I was going to get. And I never got angry Lee. I always got disappointed parent Lee, which was actually the toughest part for me because he's like, come on, mate. He's like, what's going on? He's like, you said you'd make this payment. You said you'd do it 2 weeks ago and I still haven't got it. And I had to kind of make this split-second decision just to kind of cop it. but also try and explain myself, even though I didn't have a good excuse. It was just, sorry, Lee, you've got an idiot on your hands. Like, you've got a guy that can't live.
Was Lee interested in any context?
I mean, he was as a human being. His job doesn't require context at all. His KPI is get the money back.
Did he ever give you any advice?
Oh, geez, actually, I can't remember if he did or not. I remember the pleasantries a lot more than I remember the practicality. I think I blacked that out because it was only $2,500, right? I say only. Back then.
So it was the same debt that he chased all that time?
Yes. I mean, presumably there was interest attached, but that was the one and only. It was $2,500 from a credit card I just couldn't pay off. And, that whole thing became a spiral because that camera that I'd bought on that credit card, eventually I had to hock it at cash converters for 1/11th of its value because I needed to pay a phone bill for, this is very complicated. I had been put back on my mum's phone account because I could no longer get a phone in my own name as a cadet. But because I'd missed that phone bill, her phone and internet had been cut off. I can live with it when it happens to me, but it happened to her and she called me just sobbing. And so I just went straight to cash converters and I'm like, I don't care how much you can give me for this, but just take it, give me the cash and I'll need to go and pay this bill.
You grew up in poverty. It's all you knew, even though, in your book, 100 Years of Dirt, you talk about having family that were very wealthy, but your childhood was very much spent in poverty. What's it like being a kid growing up in poverty?
This is the thing that only settles in much later on in life, but you actually don't know, even in the real teeth of it, you don't know the breadth or the scale of the problem. Like, I remember very vividly living, when we moved out into public housing in Charleville, 10 hours west of Brisbane, and we'd left the cattle station. We had literally nothing. And, that was no secret. Mum was just like, I don't have any cash. We were living on handouts and emergency food vouchers from, I don't know what organisation in Charleville. And the street we lived on was just incredibly violent. And I mean in a family violence, domestic violence context. Like, there was shouting and screaming and broken glass, like, all night long. And I remember all of this, and all I was focused on was I won an award, a year 2 award for something or other at the School of Distance Education, which is based in Charleville. And my teacher, Mrs. Muggleton, I think it was, came around and gave me this dinosaur book as a prize. And that was the most exciting part of that whole trip. So, like, it's not like, but all the while that you're cognizant of it as a child, it's doing more damage inside. And it's not until you leave that kind of tiny world and enter the big one, and then you realize how much you didn't have. It wasn't until I got to university when I saw people with actual money, and I was just like, holy shit, this is a huge gap. And then all of the stuff, that the stress and the worry and the anxiety, that's when it kicks in. And that's when it really sends you down the rabbit hole of going, what the hell happened?
Because, of course, that's such a dumb question of me, because you had nothing to compare it to. You only had one childhood. It's not like you lost a whole lot of money and had to change your lifestyle. So looking back now, what are some of the things that you just took for granted then as being ways that you had to live your life that were real signs of poverty?
Lay-by. I remember lay-buying just ordinary items like clothes and presents at Big W or Best and Less. We were always in the lay-by line, and it was such a feature of my childhood. Like, we'd go there and they'd have the little slip of paper that says, oh, you almost paid it off. And I just thought that's what everyone did. And, a lot of people in that area at the time did do that. So it wasn't so unusual. So that was one element of it. Like, I knew instinctively that we didn't have a lot of money. And so I guess the thing that you learn fastest is to not ask for things that you somehow instinctively your mum can't afford. So, like, my horizon for things that I desired became smaller, and I taught myself to be happier with little things, even though, as a kid, I wanted the best and the brightest and all of that stuff. Toward the middle of my childhood, I was just happy with a card and a little set of mum. I remember one year mum gave me like a mummy, kind of from an Egyptian pharaoh kind of mummy that was in plaster, and I just had to dig it out. And I was like 9 or 10, but that was my birthday, and that was fine because I knew that there wasn't going to be any more, and to ask for more would be even more stressful for mum.
So it seemed like you really protected her from disappointing you.
Tried to.
Yeah. Like you didn't ask for a bike or a pair of fancy sneakers or anything?
No, unfortunately, my brother did. Like, he was just obtuse in that regard. And the thing is, she tried, and, some years were better than others in terms of what she could scrape up and afford for. But even if I had been able to say, I don't want anything, and even if she had believed me, I still find this today, like, she feels such disappointment in herself for no reason for not being able to do those things. And I genuinely, I don't look back on my childhood and go, man, like, I wish I had brand name clothes. I honestly don't. Like, that wouldn't have changed my life at all. And she's just a mum. She wants her kids to be happy. And as a single mum with, scarce little time to spend with us, the easiest way to do that was with money, which, scarily enough, we didn't have any of either. So it was just kind of a paucity of options all around.
You're listening to No Filter with me, Mia Friedman, and Rick Morton. Can you explain that trap that you can get stuck in, the cycle that your mum's become stuck in and that so many people are stuck in of poverty?
Yeah. I mean, her example is structural because, she left, as many women did at the time, left school in year 10 in the 70s, I think it was. She was born in 1959. And she had one or two retail jobs working casually at David Jones in the big city in Brisbane. So she'd catch the train in from the suburban Ipswich where she grew up. And then she met my dad very young, working as a governess on a cattle station in remote Queensland. He was a ringer, basically, a jackaroo in charge of an outstation. They married, they had kids very young. She dropped out of the workforce to look after us and do chores around the station and cook for the men. So when we were turfed out with 3 kids and, a son that was burned really badly and my sister who was a newborn, she was out of the workforce for 15 years and she had no skills. And, that's the hardest thing. But there's also, there's a great example from my time on the Gold Coast. And I make the distinction, I should have been able to get by. If I had grown up normally, I would have been able to save my money and pay for all of the things I needed to do, and I would have had a much smaller life. But I was mentally unable to do it for whatever reason. And the best example of this is I was renting away from university, and then my 2 friends who were both living in on-campus accommodation, they started dating. And so she moved into his room and was like, do you want to rent my room? You won't be on the books because you have to, get approval, but you can just live there and pay me $150 a week or whatever. And I'm like, that's great because then I don't have to travel to uni. So I do that. And then in the meantime, my grandma dies, leaves a little bit of money to mum, and mum gives me $4,000 to buy my first car because that's the kind of mum she is. And 6 months after I get it, I crash it while working for the Gold Coast portion. I rear end a car and 2 more cars hit me. And I don't know how the world works. So when the tow truck driver says, do you want us to tow it? I'm like, well, yeah, because I don't know what to do with it. So he takes it. It costs $380 to get my stuff out of the car, which I don't have. And my house key to my flatmate's accommodation where I'm living is in that car, and she and her boyfriend are in Peru. So suddenly I'm homeless. Like, I actually couldn't get into the house I lived in for 2 weeks. And rather than tell people about it, it's quite funny because I couldn't afford the $380 at a time to get my stuff back, but I could afford $170 to hire a really bad car from a really dodgy car place in Surfers Paradise. And I slept in that for 2 nights and then drove all the way up to Brisbane from the Gold Coast to stay with my friends from high school who were at university for 2 weeks while still working. Then I had a debt with the car place people that I couldn't afford, so I just kept driving the car and kept entering longer term contracts because now I needed my car for work because I'm a cadet journalist and I can't travel around. And then it just goes from there and it keeps going. It keeps going. It took me years to get out of that situation.
What an incredible mental load that is as well.
Yeah, every day basically, just to be a normal worker and a normal uni student. Before any of those things began, I was figuring out, all right, where am I going to be coming from this morning? Which means where will I be staying the night before? Will I just do it in my car? I won't get a good night's sleep, but I'll be closer to the office. Or will I go to Brisbane where I know people, which is an hour away each way? And then thinking about it all day long, going, do I have enough money to eat food? Is there a free event I can go to? I did this all the time at work. I'm like, if there's a social function, I'd be like, send me, even though I hated it because I had sandwiches.
How did you get out of it?
Honestly, not until 3 years ago, the publishing of my book, the first book. I moved to Sydney. I worked for you guys for a year and a bit, and then I started at the Australian. I was earning about the same amount of money then as I'd been earning in Brisbane, but, Sydney prices, a lot higher. And as it was quite funny because my friend Bridie said to her husband was like, how the hell is Rick going to afford to live in Sydney? He can barely afford to live in Brisbane. And she's like, oh, Maddie, it doesn't matter what Rick earns. He will find a way to live on it. It could be $20,000. It could be $200,000. He will find a way, which is true. And it wasn't until, I got a lot of pay rises in a row when I was at the Australian, and I was actually earning good money for the first time in my life. And I was still running out of money to pay rent.
But why were you running out of money?
Because I wasn't used to having it. I wasn't used to it being in my bank account, and it felt weird, to be quite honest. And I also felt selfishly like I'd missed out on a lot in my early years, and I wanted to live life. Part of the equation, and this is kind of sad, but part of the equation at the time, I had a massive mental breakdown in my mid-20s, which has continued on and off for years. And, for a long time there, I just didn't think I was going to live that long. And so savings were not in the picture. I'd rather have a good today and let future Rick worry about tomorrow because I might not be here tomorrow. That was the calculus in my head. That's all it was.
That idea that you talk about so eloquently about problems for future Rick were not problems for today Rick, and it was all about today Rick. That seems like a real function of poverty and what you talked about in terms of your horizons. Future Rick is a luxury that today Rick doesn't have because he's hungry and he's got nowhere to sleep. Is that the way it goes?
Future Rick doesn't exist. So future Rick doesn't demand and shouldn't demand any of your resources because you might not ever meet that guy. In my 20s, it was hard, right? But it wasn't nearly as hard as many people do it. And for those people who are really, really, really stuck, people in intergenerational poverty, people whose parents struggled, for those people, there's nothing left over at the end of every day because I will never fully be able to explain this. But when you're in it, it's not just a daily proposition. It's not even an hourly proposition. You're thinking about it every 10 minutes. Like every 15 minutes. And every time you do, there's a panic that sets in when you're like, oh my God, I don't even know what to do by the end of the day or how I'm going to get back from this thing. And you do things just because you're like, right, I'll figure that out later. And later in this case means like in the afternoon. If you've got to go to a doctor's appointment and you can't afford a return bus fare, but you can do one way, you're like, fine, I'll go one way and something will happen. It has to, because I can't conceive of the option. So when you're doing stuff like that, tomorrow might as well not exist. And not just that, but even, if you do get a moment's respite at the end of the day, it's so terrifying. Every day is so terrifying, and imagining 5 of them in a row where you have to plan for, or 10, it's like driving a car at night. You just follow the white line. Don't think about how long the journey is. Just stay in your lane, and that's it.
I want to go back to what you said about it feeling weird. Money felt weird to you because I guess someone who hasn't experienced poverty would think, okay, so you got a good job, you started to earn money, you know what it's like to have no money, you would be like a squirrel with that money and you would be so guarded, you would be stingy, you would guard it, you would budget, you would be careful. But that's not what it feels like.
No. And granted, there are some people who go down that route. I've always said there are 2 kinds of person.
Fucking Siri watch. Sorry. Jesus, I don't understand. Shut up.
I don't know how to respond.
It's overcome with emotion about your analogy.
You just swore at Siri and she got upset.
Be quiet. Shush.
I'm
sorry. 2 types of people.
That's made my day. Yes, so there are 2 types of people. Kylie, my friend, being one of them, who budgeted spreadsheets, the whole kit and caboodle, is so terrified of going back there. And there's this kind of, I'm writing about this in my next book, about this kind of habit of kids who have been traumatized in one way or another, particularly mentally or emotionally abused kids. They have no trust, right? They trust no one. And yet, conversely, it doesn't seem to make any sense. They trust absolute strangers. Like they did these studies where they send a complete stranger to the home of a foster home of one of these kids, and they say, hey, we're going to the shops. Do you want to come? And the kid will just go off with them. And to an extent, I have the same thing. And I have it in that sense. Like I have done some stupid things, which intellectually I know not a good idea. But I also do it with money because I know that pain well. I guess it's familiar. And I feel like I can, as I got older, I could have it both ways. Like I could still live a life where I pretended to be rich and have no concerns. And then for 2 days or 3 days at the end of every pay cycle or if I got paid monthly, which I did when I was at the newspaper for a week at the end of every pay cycle, I would struggle and I'd be back there, but I knew that I could do it. And then I could live like a king. That's what everyone said. Like, Rick lives like a king at the start of the pay month. And then for the last 2 weeks, he lives like a pauper. And I like that. And I wasn't a king in a selfish way. Like, I got paid and, I would shout rounds at the bar just because I wanted to be that guy. I always wanted to be that guy and I never could be. And I just spend money on stuff, like stupid stuff.
Like what stuff?
Well, this isn't stupid, but like recently, a couple of things, like people, they're not asking for money, but they mention something on Twitter. And so like I'll DM them and I'll be like, do you need that paid for? Because I'll do it. It's always single mums that get me. And so like I'll get their bank details and transfer them $300 because I've got it. And I was doing a radio interview and someone was on the radio with me telling me a story about this book. And I told them to contact me offline and gave them, I think it was $300 or $400 in New York when I was researching my next book. I spent about $1,000, I think, on taking homeless people out to dinner, like not just giving them money, but actually going to restaurants with them. Just because, I don't know. I mean, obviously it's not a structured way to do any of these things. Like I'm not making any great impact in the bigger issue, but I know what it's like to at least a small degree to have been there, and I've got it now. And one of the best things about having money at all is that I can do these things and still take care of the people I love the most.
ScoMo said quite famously, if you have a go, you'll get a go. That didn't make you happy. And you talk about how for some money is not just a measure of worth, but of moral character.
Look, ScoMo doesn't like me very much. And I feel like if we'd got off to a better start, we would actually have seen like, not eye to eye, but I think he'd at least respect where I'm coming from.
It's funny when you say that because most people would be like, well, how does the Prime Minister have any view of you? But you have been a reporter, like you actually know him because of your work as a journalist.
I know him, and also my career nestled very closely with his because I was at every single Operation Sovereign Borders briefing when he was Immigration Minister in Sydney, and then he became Social Services Minister, which was what I wrote about, and then he became Treasurer, which affected everything I wrote about, and then he became Prime Minister, and I was on the campaign plane with him.
So how do you know he doesn't like you?
Well, because I actually had someone who went on to work for Malcolm Turnbull, ironically, but he was still a journalist at the time. And he's like, how are you and ScoMo getting along when he was still Social Services Minister? And I said, fine, I guess. I'm like, there's no particular animosity, but I just do my stories and I go to them for comment when I have to. And he's like, oh, that's all right then. He's like, because he fucking hates you. And I was just like, oh, okay, this is the first I've heard of it, but thank you. He's like, yeah, he thinks you're a bloody lefty.
Well, that's true.
Well, look, I guess on paper I am. I've always considered myself to be like more of a
centrist.
Well, not even. That word's so poisoned now, apparently. But I don't even consider that. I'm just like, things work or they don't. There's evidence or there's not. And particularly on the things I write about, I'm sure conservative politicians might like to say that I'm biased, but I would like to say that actually, no, you're talking to an expert because I lived it. You haven't. And it's not just me saying this, but it's all of the academia, like the people in the academy who you describe as elitist, but why won't you listen to actual poor people who grew up and got out and are now telling you? So yes, this have a go, if you have a go, you'll get a go slogan didn't impress me, partly on just pure English. It's like, what are you saying, man? The go is here and now it's been had over here.
How do you get a go?
Yeah, like do you have to catch it like a Pokemon or something? It's like a fishing rod. I went out to have a go, but I caught a boot instead in the Logan River. It's just silly. It doesn't say anything. But what it actually implies, it's a reverse of this kind of prosperity gospel thing, which, inadvertently he's also a proponent of in his kind of private life. It's basically saying money means you are favored, either from on high or from this wonderful nation of ours. And it means that if you're doing stuff, it means you put yourself out there, you had your go, and now you're being rewarded. It grinds my gears because, like, in May, Anglicare did their most recent survey about how many jobs there were per job seeker. So there were 116 job seekers for every entry-level job. Entry-level. So even on that arithmetic, the goes had versus goes given do not add up, and they can't add up. And that slogan is so useless at actually talking about the experience of what it's like, not just financially to have nothing, but mentally and emotionally, and the coexistence of trauma, of which I am all of these things wrapped up together. And I know, like, you look at me and say, well, Rick had money and he spent it all and he's an idiot. And that's true, but also it doesn't account for why. And if you're making policy, you need to know why.
You write, without money ever changing hands, it can make you confident. The very idea of your access to it, if needed, is performance enhancing. Because we attach worth to income or wealth, people who are not raised with the insulation of money can come to see their own ideas as being without value. Is that something you've had to learn?
Yes. And it only happened recently. And I don't just mean this in a kind of a, university debating context. I mean, even up until 3-4 years ago at the pub with friends who I knew who would be having this kind of raging debate about politics or religion or whatever, I wouldn't get involved because I just didn't think that I had anything of value to say. And maybe that made me better because I was listening all the time, which is kind of my nature anyway. But it's like I just wouldn't speak up. And when I did, I would butcher what I was trying to say because I'd get nervous and I'd be like, why am I daring to step outside of my allocated place? And, it does, having the confidence of that kind of background is it's hard to explain, but one of the best examples is actually from the song Common People by Pulp, where he's singing about this rich girl who wants to live like common people. And he's like, you could stop it all with one phone call to your dad. Like, all these roaches climbing the wall. You don't have to do it. And to you, it's a pantomime. The stakes are not the same. And it goes to your confidence as well, because it means that you can have a terrible opinion and still be okay. Like, you'll be mostly okay.
Or you can make a terrible mistake or crash your car or have an accident and you know that you'll be okay if you've got money.
Take risks and there will be a safety net there for you. And it won't be the safety net of enforced poverty and kind of malicious mutual obligation that we get with government social policy. It'll be your family who will do anything for you in most cases. And that's such a huge thing.
You've had a couple of big paydays lately. You have become an extraordinarily best-selling author with your book, 100 Years of Dirt, and you quite publicly got an enormous advance in an enormous deal for your next book. What did you do with the money? Are you rich now?
No, I don't have any of it. I've got $10,000, which I was meant to save in a separate account for hopefully a home deposit at some point. But basically, I got the money. I've spent a lot of it on researching the book. And it was, obviously it was half an excuse to just do stuff that I'd never done. I didn't travel in my 20s. I went overseas, I think 4 times before I turned 30. And it was always either for work or in one case, it was for a friend's 30th in Hawaii, which I couldn't get out of. And I was there for 7 days and I was in the same Airbnb. It was just not fun. But I'd never traveled. I'd never backpacked. I never did Europe. I never did New York. And so I thought, well, fuck it. I've got this advance. There's things I want to do in both Japan and New York that relate to this book. Why don't I just make a thing out of it? But I also upgraded my mum's bathroom. I spent $14,000 giving her a completely new bathroom, which she needed because the one that she had was just so appallingly bad.
What did that feel like to be able to do that?
That was so much fun. Like, I felt like Oprah. Like, I was home because I'd left the Australian and I was home in like June, July, and we were just chilling. I didn't have anything I needed to do. I didn't have a job, and I didn't, for the first time in my life in that immediate period, didn't need one, even though I was still panicking about it. And so I just said, I'm like, what do you want? And she's like, and she was umming and ahhing, and she's like, I'd love, just a new bathroom. And I'm like, well, let's do it. So we went to Bunnings and we bought all the fixtures, and like we were just going through the whole place. Like, we didn't go anywhere fancy, although we did go to one nice place to get a particular type of tap. I'm a reno guy now. I love this stuff. And, she went sleuthing around on Facebook Marketplace for like a really big piece of blue gum that she wanted to make someone to turn into a vanity. And then I paid someone to come in and do the whole thing properly. And they did. And it's absolutely gorgeous.
That must have felt amazing. And for her as well.
Well, as she says, it's the nicest bathroom in the worst house in Boonah.
How did you feel when you saw that big amount of money first come into your bank account?
There were 2 stages to that process. The first one was doing the deal because, again, this is not how people in the literary world talk, or people from middle class or upper class backgrounds talk. They don't talk about any of these things because it's like a bit awkward, right? Whereas I'm like, we had publishers that were in an auction. There were 14 of them. And my agent told me that she had a figure in mind for what she thought she'd be able to get for the book. And I didn't believe her because I'm like, that is stupid. Like, that is a stupid amount of money. And then the bids came in above that. 3 publishers came in above the figure that was our kind of best hope. And I felt physically sick.
I thought you would have been stoked. Why weren't you stoked?
I was, but also it was just like, for a book, I'm probably giving too much away here, but the amount of money I got for that advance was twice what my mum paid for her house. And that house purchase it didn't cost much in Boonah in 2000, but that was the culmination of a decades-long struggle for her to do something that provided for us. And here I was, without even having written the fucking book, getting an advance for twice that. Like, it felt wrong. And then, you know this better than most, but, they pay the advance in stages, typically 3. And so this one was front loaded. So the first stage was the most amount of money. And I was just like, what? Like, my bank balance, literally the day it got paid, it was 0, because that's what I do. And then it just went up like Mount Everest. And for someone who has looked at that same bank account, that same online banking portal since he was 14, and has never seen any money in that account beyond, I think the most I ever had in there was 10 grand at once. And that was because I got my tax back and I had a good year. But I'd never had more than that, ever, in my life. And then to see this come in and then realize that it was real and that theoretically I could do whatever I wanted with it was crazy. And I think I put this in the book, but I said to my mate Perry, I'm like, I feel like I should flee the country. And he's like, now, Rick Morton, he's like, this is how we know that you were poor, because you think that's enough money to make it worth fleeing the country and never working again. He's like, no one who's actually from money would flee for anything less than 10 million. Like, it was just silly.
You're going to need to learn to speak money more fluently. It sounds like you're well on your way.
I'm trying.
I love you, my friend. Your success brings me untold joy. And your mother's bathroom also, the thought of it brings me extreme joy.
I'll be going back there very soon, and I get, 4-5 weeks of that beautiful bathroom. It's better than the one I've got here. So.
Enjoy the fancy shower head.
So good. It's like a frisbee.
I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues who also came from a family where money was a real problem growing up. And she was saying how Rick was able to articulate so much about how she views money, and he was able to put words around feelings that she didn't even realise that she had about money that she earned and money that she spent. And I found the book, it's just a little book. It'll take you, it's one of those small books. It's almost like a long essay that you would read in a magazine or something. It won't take you long to read, but it really, really opened my eyes. And if you're someone who grew up struggling with money, if you still struggle with money, you will definitely feel seen and heard and understood. Later in the week, I'm going to drop my original chat with Rick from a few years ago into the feed. So keep your ears open for that. His story, his personal story. It's one of coming out, and it's one of a terrible accident and trauma when he was a kid. And he tells it with such beautiful grace. It's based on his book, 100 Years of Dirt, which was an absolute gangbuster bestseller. You can buy Rick's book on money and his memoir, 100 Years of Dirt, right now, and we will link to them in the show notes. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Elissa Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you at mumandmia.com.au.